Good evening, everyone. My name is Shelley Downey, and I'm your Regional Emergency Coordinator, REC, and I serve as the primary emergency representative statewide. To give you guys a little bit of background about what I do, I work closely with the local, state, tribal, and territorial officials and representatives in order to conduct efficient planning and coordination of potential emergency responses. Now, it is my job as one of your RECs to give you an overview of the impact of this ice storm and how it affected us at a local, state, and federal level, and the recommendations that went forth from me, the REC. Now, within the past couple of weeks, Mother Nature has truly tested the state of Vermont with the huge ice storm that was sudden and unanticipated. Many citizens were truly not prepared for it, and this storm was both underestimated as far as its strength and its impact. The state of Vermont is prone to significant snowfall with an average of about 72.4 inches. But this ice storm, on the other hand, was one of the worst winter storms we had seen in our history. It resulted in 30 deaths, $1 billion in damages, and left 600,000 people without power for 3 weeks. The governor, as well as other members of the state, local, and federal governments, devoted their time to ensuring that the citizens' needs were met. The there was constant communication and constant updates that were given on the storm through media, local television, and radio stations. This was a little difficult, however, because some people were without power, but there was a constant flow of communication as far as updates to the storm. Essential public employees worked under the 12-hour work schedule, and the governor was able to allot overtime hours in order to assist the needs of this storm. However, as the storm began to roll through parts of Vermont, it left devastating impacts, and the governor was then left with a decision to declare a state of emergency by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. There was great interagency cooperation between the local, state, and federal governments, as well as FEMA, the National Guard, and the American Red Cross. There was effective strategic planning amongst all agencies, as well as constant communication of needs. FEMA mobilized funding and resources to help the state to alleviate issues regarding the compensation of overtime. Overtime was a real issue because we had exhausted our overtime budget, so FEMA definitely helped in assisting with that because they were able to help and meet the needs of this storm. Local administrations expressed the constant need for assistance from the state and the regional emergency coordinators, such as myself, in order to identify the needs and also to channel the resources to the areas that required the most assistance. There was an emergency mutual assistance agreement that was put in place in order to ensure that the response and recovery efforts did not fall by the wayside and that they were not delayed. FEMA vowed to coordinate all disaster relief efforts to alleviate the hardship and suffering caused by this emergency and on the local population. They authorized to identify, mobilize, and provide at its discretion the equipment and resources necessary to alleviate the impacts of the emergency. The director of FEMA, Craig Fugate, visited the city of Burlington and also met with emergency management officials to review the National Incident Management Systems, NIMS. The director also surveyed the damage and met with citizens. The regional emergency coordinators, local administration expressed the constant need for assistance from the state and the RECs in order to identify the needs and also to channel resources to areas that required the most assistance. RECs assisted local administrations in analyzing the needs of the community and also liaisoned with FEMA and state authorities. As I said earlier, there was also the Emergency Mutual Assistance Agreement. There was also federal funding available to the state and local governments, as well as certain private nonprofit organizations on a cost sharing basis for emergency work and repair or replacement of facilities damaged by the severe storm for certain counties. These counties included Franklin, Orleans, Essex, Grand Isle, Lamoille, Chittenden, Washington, and Caledonia. Federal funding was also available on a cost-sharing basis for hazard mitigation measures statewide. Firefighters and EMTs worked long hours in order to address service calls throughout the storm. They provided constant feedback regarding updates on the types of service calls they were receiving. The firefighters, the fire department, stressed the importance of addressing hazardous subjects such as carbon monoxide poisoning and certain space heaters to the public. Fire departments also reported several injuries, also reported several issues regarding alternative heating sources and stated that they were unable to respond appropriately to fire alarms due to the inability to access certain areas. There were many reports of collapsed buildings due to accumulation of ice on rooftops, and there was also electrical wires touching the grounds and houses and trees, which were considered highly dangerous and could have caused severe injuries and or destruction. The department expressed their concerns regarding pipes breaking, bursting into homes and buildings due to the lack of heating, and suggested that citizens be given proper instructions regarding these matters. As the ice storm passed, as the ice storm progressed, the department eventually had to cancel all leave in order to keep up with the increase of service calls, and actually had encountered issues regarding overtime as well. As I said, it was a struggle because this ice storm exhausted all of our overtime budget. The fire department expressed concern regarding deaths from carbon monoxide poisoning as generators and vehicles were left running and many people were cooking on propane grills without appropriate ventilation within their homes. Members of the police department did their best in addressing service calls throughout this storm. The police department provided constant updated information as far as what types of service calls they were receiving and also expressed their concern regarding extra assistance needed to address all service calls expeditiously. Initially, there was numerous accidents and several cars that were abandoned on streets and highways. There was also concerned initially with the regard for evacuating the elderly and disabled persons that were living in critical or dangerous conditions. As the storm progressed, the leave for employees for police officers were also canceled, and there was a dramatic increase in service calls. However, a third of its forces were difficult to mobilize due to the recent winter holiday, and many of them were out of town. So, this was also another issue that came up in this department. There were many calls entailed to burglaries to residences and businesses as people became desperate for food and supplies. There was also many complaints regarding fraud from so-called contractors who were making money by not providing for services such as, tree trimming. At one point, there was also a lookout for a group of teens looting at warehouses at night and putting items on the black market for double the value. And at some point, the 911 call systems became inoperable. And as a result, there was an increase of crimes, and jails began to become overcrowded, and court systems remained closed. The increase in jail population also called for an increase in supplies in order to maintain the jail. The Department of Transportation, during most of the storm, roads, and highways were declared not drivable, and citizens were urged to avoid driving at all costs. The fast-moving storm changed from snow to freezing rain due to the changing temperatures. And actually, before this storm, there was an ice storm prior to this that left several inches of ice. So, what was already there, this current storm just added on to, and this increased the likelihood of downed trees, power lines, and damages to structures. During most of the storm, as I said, citizens were urged not to drive. At one point, it was reported that as much as 100 people were stranded at the Burlington airport due to flight cancellations and road conditions. However, these people were eventually rescued. The Department of Transportation officials expressed concern regarding the reliability of their equipment as ice began to build on their equipment. They were unsure if they could continue to work properly given the unusual amount of freezing rain that developed. The trucks would eventually need repairs, or things would need to eventually be replaced as a result of heavy work during the ice storm. The hospital injury reports began to increase as the storm moved through the area. Initially, there were many reports regarding leg and hip fractures, primarily because of slippery sidewalks and streets. However, hypothermia became another critical issue reported during the course of the storm. Doctors expressed concerns regarding the elderly and disabled. Public health officials expressed concerns about the safety of using alternative heating sources, which could result in a fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. As the storm progressed, health authorities reported that Fletcher Allen and Vermont Children's Hospital were running on backup generators and had only enough fuel to last 24 hours and were urging for additional fuel. Also, blood supplies were beginning to run low and there was a strong need for all blood types. Hospitals were becoming inundated with many calls regarding, people searching for missing family members and were unsure of where to redirect these calls to. The electric company, Velco, Vermont Electric Company, employees worked long hours in order to assess the scope of damages on its power network and address each issue. Initially, there were several teams that were sent to assess the damages, but throughout the course of the storm, no definitive answer was given as far as to the estimated time for restoration of the electricity. Velco was able to reach out to neighboring states for assistance. After the storm began to hit parts of Velco, or hit parts of Vermont, Velco reported that there were several miles of power lines lying on the ground and that the company was working with 100% of its technical resources but couldn't overcome the situation as a whole. The CEO of Velco even said that it could take a few months to rebuild the entire power system. The company also faced unforeseen issues such as several parts and materials critical to the reconstruction being on back order. Velco employees continued to have trouble reaching areas where there needed to be repairs as far as power lines, but the truck fleet suffered from ice accumulation, which took several days to repair. The company expressed that they were in desperate need of support terms of workforce and adequate material to repair the vast power system in Vermont. The governor requested 3,000 National Guard officers to be deployed to Vermont. Shelters were available for up to 10,000, but were being filled up quickly. The American Red Cross sent supplies to Ethan Allen Force Base within 24 hours and delivered the inventory to shelters. Volunteer groups as well as charity organizations all came together in order to assist in some way with donations or their time and efforts. Small fights were seen and thefts occurred within these shelters, and there was requests for additional police officers. Throughout the widespread relief, though there was widespread relief, it was not targeted. Commodities provided by the relief did not address immediate needs of the populations, and volunteers eventually were becoming exhausted due to the long hours of work. In the private sector, millions of dollars have been lost through banking, energy, retailing services being the most affected. A large number of residential areas were in need of serious repairs, and several families of the state were faced with thousands of dollars in home repair. Power lines would need to be rebuilt with new standards that can resist the unusual ice accumulation, and schools and shopping malls would also need to be assessed for damages and possibly rebuilt. The impact of the storm caused major power outages, which left many residents in Vermont without jobs as they could not go to work. Private industries also lost service jobs, and many faced unemployment as a result of the loss of business. Private sectors Private sector employees were fired because they were unable to physically go to work, and many residents didn't have any type of access to money and could not pay for basic needs, which only made the monetary situation worse. As far as the economy, the economic output is expected to decrease by 1.5% over the next year, and there had been 535,200 insurance claims, which totals to about $790 million in damages. The electric power systems dropped to 14.2% during the disaster, and goods producing industries are expected to fall to 2.4%. Other things affected were the milk farms, maple syrup, and apple industries, as, as they are expected to be severely affected by the impact of the storm. Media was also an issue. There were many reporters that came from around the country and Canada to make their way up to the Burlington area in order to cover this ice storm as it developed. Media outlets were contacting the mayor's office requesting interviews, and there was also reports of news crews setting up cameras and their equipment in the work zones that were designated for Velco employees. The filming and interviewing of workers interfered with the progress of Velco. However, television ratings were very high, and the media was kept up to date regarding the situation every hour, and they were able to relay this to those who still had power and were able to view television. Environmentally, the state left behind the storm left behind tremendous destruction, and many farmers began to be concerned with what to do with deceased livestock. There was also thousands of trees that had been destroyed, to include maple, syrup, and apple farms. And with the depletion of this food and habitat, wildlife was also expected to suffer. Psychologically, the workers, the firefighters, police officers, and the volunteers began to suffer from stress and fatigue. Citizens also experienced long-term stress because of the duration of the disaster, and there was some concern that some may even develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from some of the affecting some victims that were severely exposed to the current disaster. Authorities of the Burlington and Chittenden needed assistance in developing a strategic recovery plan. The purpose of this plan was to reestablish a healthy, functioning community that would sustain itself over time. Regional emergency coordinators, RECs, were requested to develop a plan that would serve as a model adaptable to the current situation. The areas to be addressed include financing, expediting long-term housing recovery, supporting recovery of downtown businesses and the whole economy, and ensuring local government facilities and services recover smoothly. The recommendations were deemed short or long-term recommendations. So I have a couple that I will go over with you. Some of, like I said, were our short-term recommendations and some long-term. So one of the short-term recommendations was that the government of Vermont respectfully should request an increase in budget funds from the federal government to assist with the damages and for additional resources to assist with these efforts. Potentially, we should start a new budget in order to better put us in a better position for expected harsh winters. That way, we don't run out of money. I think that it would be beneficial to have like a separate fund or a separate budget for this. The state government should also request more members of the National Guard, Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the Red Cross to assist with volunteer efforts such as handing out more food supplies to families or helping to manage shelters at the local schools. This is also a short-term recommendation. Um, just for the time being, we just need an increase of volunteers in order to assist. The state government should also reach out to the state government of New Hampshire, New York, and Maine for extra volunteers, as well as additional firefighters, EMTs, police officers to assist with Burlington and other counties in Vermont. This is a short-term recommendation. However, long-term, we would like to see potentially a emergency response team comprised of a certain amount of EMTs, firefighters, police officers, medical personnel, Department of Transportation personnel, electrical company personnel, construction, and volunteers from each state, like a designated team, in order to call upon them if we have a dire emergency, so that the team is already in place and they can just report as soon as they get the call. The next recommendation was to recommend extra volunteer police officers that could assist at local shelters to maintain order and to be utilized to tame the media personnel from bombarding the Velco employees. This is a short term recommendation. The state government should also reach out to the Department of Transportation in Maine and New Hampshire for workers and equipment to assist in clearing roadways. This is also a temporary, short term recommendation. However, long term, we would like to see, like I said, a designated emergency response team. That way, we can call them as soon as there is an emergency and we can get people down here right away. The state government should also reach out to local landfills of the state of Vermont in order to address the disposal of deceased animals. This is something that is a long-term goal. We need to have this established now so that if this any other type of natural disaster occurs, we know exactly who to call and to address this issue. The state government should also reach out to the neighboring medical facilities, such as Exeter Hospital in New Hampshire and Englewood Hospital in New Jersey, to assist local hospitals with the volume of medical calls. Some of the volunteers from the mental health field should also be requested to assist with the stress management and mental health of the patients. This is something that is a long term goal. We would like to have designated teams, as I said earlier, in the hospital and the medical field in order to quickly assist our hospitals here in our area so that it can help with the volume of calls and patients being seen. We think that as far as power restoration, we think that the hospital should be first priority and recommend that they are the first to get power restored. And long term, we'd like to see maybe a better infrastructure of the hospitals with better backup equipment and generators in order to assist when the power does go out during a time of emergency. The state government um, would like to reach out, or is recommended that they reach out to the neighboring states for electrical assistance, such as the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative Incorporation and the Central Maine Power Corporation, in order to assist with efforts in restoring power to residents and businesses at a faster rate. This is a long term recommendation. We would like Velco to kind of reach out to other electrical companies in other states, particularly the two I just mentioned, and to develop like an emergency response team, as I said, so they can call upon them as soon as a emergency strikes. We can have a designated team already deployed. To assist with overcrowding in jails, our short-term recommendation is that those with petty charges could be forced to do volunteer work around the community, such as planting trees, rebuilding, etc., as opposed to serving time or being on probation. We'd also like to, short-term recommendation is to reach out to the courts and the court systems in other counties or states in order to maybe assist with the overcrowding in jails. We also recommended that strategic plans regarding assistance from fellow states be better structured for the future in order to avoid having to set up plans at the last minute with various requests. And the only downfall, this emergency response was good in essence that everyone there was good support as far as local and state federal governments, and there was good communication. But as far as the strategic planning for reaching out to fellow states, we'd like to work on that um, and develop better strategic plans. We also recommend that regardless of the severity of the storm or emergency, that safety precautions as far as local locations of shelters and necessary items to bring and safety precautions regarding space heaters and carbon monoxide are all televised and maybe ran at the bottom of the screen so that people can be up to date as far as um, what safety precautions are and the nearest location of shelters. By coming all together, this local, state, and federal governments and various agencies, public and private sectors, and citizens from Vermont and other neighboring states, the state of Vermont will see the light at the end of the tunnel. All the efforts and moving parts will play key roles into rebuilding this community and making it stronger and better prepared.